They called it a restructuring. That's the word my son-in-law used when he stood up in front of 43 employees in the main conference room on a Tuesday morning in October. Restructuring. Like it was something clean and surgical, like he was a doctor and the company was a patient who just needed a little trimming around the edges. What he actually said was, "Some of you represent the old way of doing things, and the old way is done." Then he looked directly at me. I'd been with Caldwell Industrial Supply for 22 years. 22 years of 6 a.m. starts, of driving out to client warehouses in the rain, of knowing every purchasing manager at every manufacturing plant within a 300-mile radius by first name, by family situation, by the particular way each of them needed to be approached when a contract was up for renewal. I knew which clients needed to feel like they were getting a deal and which ones needed to feel like they were getting exclusivity. I knew who played golf on Saturdays and who coached Little League on Thursday evenings. I wasn't just a procurement coordinator. I was the nervous system of that company's vendor relationships, and I had been for over 2 decades. My son-in-law, I'll call him by his first name, which is Bryce because I think he's earned the loss of the courtesy title, had married my daughter 4 years earlier. Nice enough guy at the barbecues. Shook hands firmly, laughed at the right moments, never overstayed his welcome at Thanksgiving. Then my father-in-law, who had founded Caldwell and run it quietly and well for 31 years, decided to step back from operations at 72. He didn't fully retire. He just stopped coming in every day and handed the reins to his daughter's husband because, in his words, family keeps it in order. I had no opinion about that when it happened. It wasn't my company. I just worked there. And for the first year of Bryce's leadership, things weren't so different. He held meetings I didn't used to have to attend. He put a strategy consultant on retainer. He started using words like ecosystem and velocity in contexts that made no particular sense. But the work kept getting done. The contracts kept renewing. The clients kept calling me, specifically because that's how it had always worked. The trouble started when Bryce hired a firm to audit our vendor relationships and tell him where we were, quote, leaving money on the table. The firm sent a 26-year-old with a laptop and a template. She spent 3 weeks asking me questions I'd answered 100 times before, pulling contracts I could have summarized faster by memory, building a spreadsheet that I could have told her was missing entire categories of context that no spreadsheet would ever capture. The long-term pricing agreements I'd negotiated weren't just about numbers, they were about trust. They were about the fact that when a supplier had a rough quarter, I called and worked it out quietly, and they remembered that the next time we needed priority allocation. That's not in a cell on a spreadsheet. That's in 22 years of phone calls and handshakes and showing up when it mattered. The audit came back recommending we consolidate our supplier base and move to a centralized digital procurement platform. The consultant's report described my approach as relationship-dependent and non-scalable. Bryce loved it. He announced the new platform at an all-hands in February. He announced it like it was a moon landing. Screens, a presentation with animations, a video that the firm had apparently produced. He talked about efficiency and transparency and removing bottlenecks from the system. He used that word 3 times, bottleneck. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was too practiced for that. But every person in that room looked at me, because every person in that room knew who he was talking about. I went back to my desk that afternoon and kept working. I had 4 renewals coming up in the next 6 weeks. I had a supplier in Akron who was already nervous about the platform transition because their account manager had called me personally to ask what was going on. I had a client in Toledo who needed a special allotment of industrial fasteners before their fiscal quarter closed, and I was the only one who knew their purchasing manager had a hard cutoff on approvals after the 20th of the month. I kept working because that's what I'd always done. In March, Bryce called me into his office and told me the company was moving forward with full platform implementation by Q3 and that my role was being sunset. His word, sunset. Like I was a government program or a software license. He said I'd have 60 days, that HR would walk me through the severance package, and that he appreciated my years of contribution to Caldwell. I said, "Does your father-in-law know about this?" He said, "He's been briefed." I said, "Okay." That was it. I stood up, shook his hand. I don't know why I did that old habit, some reflex of professional courtesy that apparently survived even that moment, and I walked back to my desk. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't send a company-wide email. I didn't call my long-term suppliers and tell them what was happening. I didn't reach out to any of the clients I'd built relationships with over 2 decades and warn them that the person who knew their contracts inside and out was being walked out the door. I didn't do any of that, not because I was planning something, but because it wasn't my place to do it. If Bryce wanted to transition those relationships, he had 60 days to ask me to help him do it properly. He didn't ask. What he did instead was announce at the next all hands that the company was entering an exciting new phase of operational modernization, and that some legacy roles were being phased out as part of a planned evolution. He thanked me by name in front of everyone for my years of service. Past tense. Years of service. I sat in my chair and I looked at the table in front of me and I thought about a conversation I'd had maybe 10 years earlier with the founder, my father-in-law's predecessor at the operational level, a man who had built Caldwell up from a regional distributor into a mid-sized industrial supply company that actually meant something to the manufacturers who depended on it. He'd told me once, "The suppliers don't work with the company, they work with you. You know that, right? When you leave, some of them are going to leave too. So don't leave." I hadn't planned to. My 60 days ran out at the end of May. I cleaned out my desk over a weekend by myself, which is how I'd wanted it. I handed my badge to the security guard on my last Friday afternoon. I didn't make a speech. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I took the framed photo of my wife and me at the Grand Canyon, the coffee mug my daughter had given me years ago that said, "World's okayest dad," and a small cactus I'd been keeping alive on my windowsill for 7 years. I had already accepted a position at a competing firm the week before, Senior Vice President of Supplier Relations, a title I'd never had before, with a salary that made me feel slightly embarrassed I hadn't pushed harder at Caldwell years ago. The competing firm had been trying to hire me for 3 years. I'd always said no out of loyalty. Now the loyalty had been restructured. What happened next wasn't something I planned or orchestrated. I want to be clear about that. Not to protect myself. I don't think I did anything wrong. But because I think the distinction matters morally, I didn't make any calls. I didn't send any warnings. I didn't give anyone a heads up. I just stopped being the person who held things together. The first sign came in mid-June, about 2 weeks after I left. I heard through a former colleague, someone still at Caldwell who called me to catch up, that the supplier in Akron had declined to migrate to the new platform. Their contract was due for renewal at the end of June, and they told Bryce's procurement team that they'd be reviewing their options. What my former colleague didn't know, and what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd known for 6 months that the Akron supplier had been approached by a competitor. I'd been the reason they stayed, not because of price, because the owner's son had gone through a rough stretch personally 2 years ago, and I'd covered for a late shipment quietly and nobody at Caldwell ever knew about it. He owed me a debt of goodwill, not a financial debt, just the kind of debt that makes a person pick up the phone when you call and listen when you talk. Bryce's team didn't know any of that. The platform didn't know any of that. The Akron supplier walked at the end of June, took their volume to a competitor. Then the situation in Toledo came apart. The purchasing manager there, a man I'd worked with for 11 years, who had a specific way he needed contracts presented and a specific timeline for approvals that the new platform's automated system didn't accommodate, submitted a formal complaint in July that his orders were being processed incorrectly and that response times had tripled. He escalated to the VP level at his company. Caldwell's team scrambled. They didn't know that this particular client had a clause in their master agreement, one I'd negotiated 8 years earlier and renewed twice since, that allowed them to exit the contract with 60 days' notice if service standards fell below a defined threshold. They triggered the clause in late July. I heard about it the same way I heard about everything now, secondhand, through former colleagues who still called, through the industry network that moves information the way rivers move water, quietly and in all directions at once. I didn't call anyone to ask. I didn't track what was happening, but I wasn't deaf either. By August, 3 more supplier agreements had lapsed or were in dispute. The platform implementation had hit technical problems that the consultant firm couldn't resolve without understanding the specific ways individual suppliers had been invoicing us, custom arrangements I'd built over years that didn't map cleanly to a standardized system. One supplier, a small family-owned operation in western Pennsylvania that we'd worked with for 14 years, simply sent a letter saying they were no longer interested in continuing the relationship. No drama, no negotiation, just a letter. I imagine they'd been waiting for an excuse. The Toledo client's exit created a ripple. 2 other clients in the same industry segment, manufacturers who talked to each other at trade shows, who mentioned at a conference in September that Caldwell's service levels had slipped, began their own reviews. One of them called me directly, not to complain about Caldwell, just to let me know they were thinking through their options and wanted to know if I was happy at my new place. I told them I was settling in well, and I let them draw whatever conclusions they chose to draw. I heard from my former colleague in October that Bryce had called an emergency leadership meeting. The quarterly numbers were significantly below projection. 3 major client accounts in review or active departure, 5 supplier relationships disrupted or severed. The new platform, which was supposed to generate efficiency savings of roughly 14%, was instead generating a service backlog and an invoice dispute rate that had finance working overtime. The consultant firm had moved on to their next engagement. I heard, and I want to be careful here because this is secondhand, that at some point during this period, my father-in-law came back into the building. Not for a meeting. Just walked in one morning, the way he used to, because it was still his company on the documents that mattered, and that he sat in the conference room for a long time looking at a report that someone had put together showing the vendor relationship losses and what they projected to mean for the following fiscal year. I heard that when Bryce came in that morning and saw his father-in-law sitting there, the room went very quiet. I heard that my father-in-law, who was a man of few words in the way that only people who've actually built something tend to be, said something along the lines of, "Who's handling the Harmon Group account now?" The Harmon Group was Caldwell's largest client. 14-year relationship, 15% of annual revenue. I had personally renewed their master agreement every 2 years, always in person, always over a dinner that I paid for out of my own pocket because it felt right to do it that way, and they'd always appreciated that. Their procurement director and I had been at the same company in our early careers, briefly, and we'd stayed in loose contact ever since. The answer to my father-in-law's question was apparently, nobody was handling it in any meaningful sense. An account rep had been assigned, someone who'd been with the company 18 months, who communicated with the Harmon Group exclusively through the platform's ticketing system. The Harmon Group's contract came up for review in November. I got a call in late October from their procurement director. He didn't beat around anything. He said, "I want to do right by you and give you fair warning. We're going to be looking at our options when the contract is up. Nothing personal to Caldwell, but the relationship is changed." I thanked him for telling me. I told him I hoped they found what they were looking for. I didn't make any moves. I wasn't in a position to. My new employer had no overlap with the Harmon Group's business, so there was nothing to gain. I just let him know I understood, and I wished him well, and that was that. The Harmon Group did not renew. I don't know exactly what the financial impact was. I'd heard numbers, but I trust secondhand industry gossip about as far as I can throw it. What I know is that by the end of that fiscal year, Caldwell Industrial Supply had experienced a significant contraction in both revenue and vendor relationships. I know that the platform implementation was quietly scaled back. I know that Bryce brought in a new consultant, a different firm this time, to do a damage assessment. I know because my father-in-law called me in December. He didn't call to apologize exactly. He's not that kind of man. He called to talk, the way he used to call me sometimes on Sunday evenings to talk about the business, just thinking out loud, processing. He talked for a while about what he was seeing, about how you can't replace 20 years of relationship equity with a software dashboard, about how the manufacturers they served had choices, always had choices, and they've been choosing Caldwell because of people, not systems. He said it wasn't what he'd intended when he stepped back. He said he thought the younger generation understood things he didn't, and maybe he'd given too much credit to confidence. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was well. I told him the new position was going better than I'd expected. There was a long pause, and then he said, "I should have made sure we had a proper transition." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's on me." I said, "I know." We talked a little more after that about nothing in particular, and then we said goodbye. Bryce is still married to my daughter, and I want to say clearly that I have no interest in that situation becoming more complicated than it already is. Family is family. My daughter is smart and capable, and she'll make her own assessments. I've never said anything to her about what happened at Caldwell in any detailed sense, and I don't intend to. What happened at work is separate from what happens at the dinner table, or it ought to be. But here's what I've been thinking about since all of this unfolded. There's a kind of arrogance that comes with credentials. I've seen it over the years, the MBA, the consulting report, the platform rollout, the slide deck with animations. There's a seduction to systems, to the idea that if you design the right process, you can remove the human variable and make everything cleaner and more predictable. And sometimes that's true. There are absolutely inefficiencies in any organization built by humans who've been improvising for decades. But a client who has been with you for 14 years because of a person is not an inefficiency. They're a relationship. And a supplier who stayed with you through a rough patch because someone picked up the phone and said, "We'll work this out." That's not a bottleneck in your system. That's the reason the system works. I didn't do anything to Caldwell. I just left when I was told to leave. The relationships I'd built went with me, not because I took them, but because that's how relationships work. You can't transfer goodwill via a handoff document. You can't migrate trust to a new platform. You can't restructure 22 years of showing up and make it scalable. I documented everything I could in my last 60 days. I left notes on every active account. I organized the contract files in a way that should have made them accessible to whoever came next. I flagged the renewals coming up in the following 6 months. I did all of that because it was the right thing to do, and because I'd been asked, on paper, in my original offer letter, to maintain organized records as part of my responsibilities. Nobody read them. Or if they did, they didn't understand what they were reading. There's a lesson in there somewhere. Several, probably. About succession, about institutional knowledge, about the difference between a process and a person, about the hubris of thinking you can audit your way to understanding something that was built through years of human contact. I'm not bitter about what happened. I want to be honest about that, even though I know it sounds like something people say when they're bitter. I genuinely have moved past it, mostly because my new position has been good, and because I've been given the chance to build something again from a different foundation. And I find I still love the work when the work is given room to breathe. But I do think about the founder sometimes. A man who spent 31 years building relationships, building a company that meant something, and then watched from a step back as someone who'd never actually earned a single one of those relationships decided they were inefficiencies to be eliminated. He called it a restructuring. Turns out the thing he restructured was the reason the whole structure stood. I've thought about what to call what happened, and the most honest word I've found is consequence. Not revenge, not justice in some grand sense, just the natural consequence of decisions that were made by people who didn't fully understand what they were deciding. Bryce made a choice. He looked at 22 years of relationship building and saw overhead. He looked at trust that had been constructed through hundreds of small moments, a covered shipment, a phone call at the right time, a dinner paid out of pocket because it mattered to do it that way, and he saw inefficiency. He ran an audit on something that couldn't be audited and got back a report that confirmed what he already wanted to believe. Then, he acted on it. That's not evil. I want to be clear about that. Bryce isn't a villain in the way stories like to have villains. He's something more ordinary and in some ways more instructive. A person who confused confidence with understanding. He had credentials, he had authority, and he had a consulting firm telling him he was right. What he didn't have was the patience to learn what he didn't know before he started dismantling what was already working. And that's really the whole story, isn't it? The Akron supplier didn't leave because I asked them to. The Harmon Group didn't walk because I made a call. The platform didn't fail because someone sabotaged it. Everything that happened was the direct and predictable result of removing something essential without understanding what it was holding up. My father-in-law understood that eventually. He said it himself. He should have ensured a proper transition. He built the thing. He knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, how it worked. He just stepped back far enough and long enough that he'd allowed himself to stop paying attention. What I keep coming back to is this. Knowledge that lives only inside one person is always a risk, but it doesn't become that person's fault to carry. I sent the emails, I flagged the renewals, I left the notes. I did the things I was supposed to do because that's what integrity looks like when nobody's watching. You do the right thing anyway, even for a company that just told you you're a bottleneck. Even for a son-in-law who shook your hand with the ease of someone who'd never once doubted himself. Integrity isn't about getting credit for it. It's about being able to look at yourself clearly and know you didn't cut corners on the way out the door. The resilience part, the part I'm still processing honestly, is that you don't get to control how the story lands. I spent 22 years building something and then watched it unravel from a distance, secondhand over phone calls from former colleagues. That's a particular kind of hard. You can't fix it. You're not supposed to fix it. You just have to trust that the work you did was real, that the relationships you built were real, and that those things don't disappear just because someone with a slide deck decided they were legacy costs. My new position has been good. Better than I expected. And I notice I'm building things the same way I always have, slowly, personally, with attention to the specific person I'm talking to and what they actually need. Some habits are habits because they work. The founder called me in December, and at the end of that call, after the long pause, after he said that's on me, I felt something I wasn't expecting. Not satisfaction, not vindication, something quieter. The feeling of a person who did the work right and can live with how it went. That's the only thing any of us can really aim for.